This is a talk that I created back when I was at my previous job at Gusto in like 2019 that I've given 2 or 3 times since then in some format or another. And if you're wondering why is an infrastructure engineer talking to us about RSpec stuff, my background's actually all in Rails. So I started out doing backend Rails engineering, kind of moves to full stack Rails and React, and worked at a few different places, and then sort of switched into the infrastructure DevOps space back in November of 2020. But still have kind of worked in sort of a role that bridges the gap between like pure infrastructure work and the engineers working on the application. So I still kind of hop in from time to time to do different things. And before I left Gusto, I was leading what we called the testing guild. We were trying to improve sort of testing practices around, and that was where I last gave this talk. So to talk about testing generally, real quick, there's a difference, right, between a test and a test suite. And I'll pause here for a second too and say this talk is very participatory. We're going to get to a lot of opinions that I have that I've built up over the years around testing. So like, I probably won't see a question if you drop it in the chat, but if you want to raise your hand, I'll try to be looking over and let people hop in at different points here. So what makes a good test versus a test suite? Tests should be readable and easy to follow, right? You can tell what's being tested easily, and you don't have to hop around to a bunch of different places to find all the different parts of your test. Ideally, they're small and you have one assertion in there. I will say that may not hold for end-to-end tests or feature tests where you're clicking around, but especially for unit tests, you want them to be small and concise. They should be accurate, which means they actually portray the behavior of the code correctly. And it should be tested on the correct level, right? So you're testing what is actually under test and nothing more, again, with feature tests sort of aside from that. Test suites, on the other hand, right now, as the group of your tests should be thorough. So they should cover all paths in your code in there. Any if statement you have, any ternary operator you have, should all be covered in some way in your tests. They should be uncluttered, and by that I mean no unnecessary test setup, right? If you only need 2 users in a test to test something, you shouldn't create 5 of them. That makes it harder to follow. Ideally, your test suites are also consistent. I'm sure people have hopped into larger Rails projects where like in one part of the code, tests are written in one way, and another part they're written in a totally different way, and you kind of have to like mentally keep all that together. So I really try to, on a team, sort of find a consistent pattern for writing codes so that you just don't have that mental overhead anytime you hop into a file. And deterministic, this is my favorite one on here. People like to call tests flaky, which kind of implies that like, oh, there's nothing we can do about it. They're just going to flake sometime. Really, they're non-deterministic, right? So your test should always pass or you should always fail, and you shouldn't have any weird order dependencies in their thing. I like to follow the 3 A's for testing, if you haven't heard them before. So they are arrange, which is set up all the objects that need to be tested, along with any other necessary setup. Then act, so actually do the thing you're trying to test. And then assert, right? So make claims about the object that you're testing or any of its collaborators on there. I tend to find that if you follow this consistently, it's a lot easier to actually figure out what's going on in your test. It can be difficult when people start arranging stuff and then acting, and then maybe arrange more things and act more things, to sort of be doing a lot in tests to be able to actually follow what's going on. And I'm sure since we're talking RSpec here, the expect to receive always gets very confusing, especially for new developers, because you call it before you actually act on a thing. So you're sort of flipping the order of assert and act, which I don't love. So some disclaimers about the rest of this talk. All rules have exceptions, which is why I call these best practices and not rules. Not all the things I'm going to talk about that I think you should do in testing are widely practices at all the places that I've worked. And some of them are generally accepted, I would say. Some of them are really like based on my experience here. So again, feel free to hop in if you want to disagree with me. I love being disagreed with on parts of this talk. The first one here is don't leave important code paths untested, right? If your method is 2 different if statements, having one test that only goes through one path is not going to help you catch any bugs there, right? It's also going to make change for your code harder later because you have some existing functionality that's not actually covered under your test, so you don't know if you're going to introduce a regression. You should always test all code paths, right? Your tests are documentation in the end, which is sort of one of the things I like to hammer home here. If you are testing all your code paths in there, you are leaving human readable documentation for what that code does and what it should do in every case that you have there. Don't be so general that you aren't testing the real behavior of the code. So I see this a lot where people will say, like, expect this thing to change some model dot count by -1, right? Which will pass if any instance of that model is deleted, which is probably not the thing that you're trying to test, which is to say, hey, I ran this method and it deleted this user specifically, right? So instead, you want to be specific enough to actually cover the use case that you're testing on here. So doing something like delete it, then expect that if you reload that instance from active record, you get the active record not found error, right? So it's important if you say, like, this test is meant to delete this user, that you are actually doing that. This one tends to be a little controversial. I hate shared examples and shared context. I have seen in all the Rails shops I've worked at that they tend to be like start out small and sort of helpful, and then quickly become very bloated. I have seen shared context referencing shared context referencing shared context across like multiple files there, to the point where you have no idea where these objects are coming from that are being set up. And to be honest, I just don't want to go to a different file when I'm looking at tests. Like, I want to be able to just have everything there in one test. I'm sure everybody's heard the DRY acronym, right? Don't repeat yourself. When it comes to test files specifically, I like to do the opposite, which is WET, which is wildly explicit tests, right? Sometimes when you extract these things out, like a shared example, to have, you know, less lines of code you can drop in for all these different use cases, you're actually hiding the fact that you might be able to like extract some functionality there that would allow it so you don't have to repeat yourself. So by making it really easy and dry, you're potentially like hiding an extraction that could be that you might have noticed otherwise, right? So I personally shy away from these. At my first team at Gusto, I just banned people from using them and refused to approve any PR on our team that had them. That's how strongly I feel about that. Don't ever assert absolute database counts. If a method adds a record to the database, you don't actually care, right? Like, how many things were there before that, right? The thing you're actually testing is that something got inserted to the database. It has nothing to do with where there's 0 things in there before or 5 things in there before, right? So I see a lot of more junior developers do something like assert user.count is 0, and then do something, and then assert user.count is 1, right? Which can make the test very brittle also, because if somebody puts a let bank statement at the top of the file for a different test, let's say, that includes a user, now this existing test is going to fail when it shouldn't have, really, right? Because it has nothing to do with that. So the change matcher is the best way to get around this, right? You can expect something to change by 1, and then you don't have to care about how many things were there beforehand. It also can be pretty brittle to assert really explicit date and times. Tests can flake. I've seen it happen a lot due to like millisecond failures, right? Where you're asserting some time against another time there. And to be honest, you probably don't care about being that specific down to the few like milliseconds or nanoseconds, right? So one of the things I found in my time testing is that you can call on a time object this dot change and then nsec 0, and that will basically like set all the milliseconds, everything down to 0. So you're never worried about that level of granularity. Or if you only care about like a date part of it and not the time part of it, only actually assert about the part that you care about, like parse it into a string and just assert against the year, month, and day, or something like that. This one I see bite people all the time, especially in controller tests, but don't assume there's going to be an order to results if the underlying query that gets that data for you has no order on it. As part of my testing guild work at Gusto, I put out a survey at one point to all the engineers that asked some questions about testing. And one of them was, if you don't assert an order for your database query, will you get it back in ID order? And the answer is no. most of the time, yes, but you're not guaranteed that ever. So making that assumption is going to lead to flakes at some point. So a lot of times I'll see when people are testing against like a controller and they have an endpoint that's going to return an array of things, they'll make an assertion on the first thing and just say, you know, whatever my response dot first is should be this, and response dot last should be this. And then eventually that's going to flake because at some point those things are to come back in the opposite order here. So do use find, the array method find, to pick out the element based on some identifier, right? So if you're getting two things back from an endpoint, you could say, find me the one that has ID 1, and then I'll go assert some other stuff against it. Find me the one that has ID 2, I can go assert some other stuff against it. Related to that, don't assert order if order doesn't matter. So if you use the match identifier for RSpec, and you say you want this thing to match another thing, match is always going to assert if those things are in the same order here. Allison, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Do you know why you don't get the IDs back? Is this like a computing thing, like a excuse me for not explaining it really well, but like the request doesn't return to like Postgres or whatever database you're using, doesn't like, takes a little bit longer to get certain records back, and so it's not like interleaving the results. I don't actually know.
Oh yeah, so
it's works in that way, but yeah.
So it's a database slash like active record thing, I would say. So the database is never going to guarantee you an order unless you specifically have an order by clause tacked on to the end of your SQL query. An active record will not add an order by clause unless you specifically put like a dot order ID ascending or something like that. So like if you aren't adding that order by clause with active record, it's never going to send one to the database, and then the database won't guarantee any order coming back to you. Does that make sense?
But it does most of the time.
Yeah. Now, why it does that most of the time, I don't know. I don't know. That's
okay.
A weird database quirk, I would say, is that like, as far as I know, you're not guaranteed any order. Now, I would say they just happen to, with active record, come back in ID order most of the time. But again, like there is no guarantee for that. Rose, you got your hand up.
Yes, I recently learned more about this than I thought I would ever need to know. The query planner inside a database, I always imagined like the query is a very simple thing where it just like goes through the index and grabs stuff, and that's very repeatable. But the query planner is actually like rather complex code all on its own that is optimizing to make sure that it is reading the data in the most optimal way possible. So the database is actually going based on a whole bunch of factors that I don't fully understand. What is the optimal, quickest way to get this data for you, which is why it might pull it in different orders at different times unless you tell it.
Yeah, I could have a whole other talk on database stuff, but it's right there. And also, like what the query planner does is based on statistics that it calculates the time. It's based on data volume. It could change based on adding like a bunch of rows very suddenly to a table that it could choose to have to do something different. So that's a whole other thing. But like I don't know, the TLDR to take away from this one is like, if you care about the order, specify the order on your query. If you don't care about the order, don't specify it. But definitely don't get in the mixed situation where you care about it, but you did not actually specify it, because that's like guaranteed test flakiness there. Cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for hopping in. Okay, yeah, so still on that topic of order, match is going to assert order every time. So if you say you have something match an array, it's not only going to care that the things you want are in that array, but that they're specifically in that order. If your underlying query doesn't specify an order, again, that's going to flake sometimes. So you can use match array or contain exactly, which will just assert the membership of that array, but not the order of the elements in it. So if you truly don't care about the order of something returned, these are good ones to use. They will make it so your tests don't flake. It's another one I've seen a lot. So faker, I'm pretty sure we've all used to generate some data for our tests for things we don't care about, right? You often have factory bot factories that are using Faker under the hood, so you don't have to go set it against all the time. But there are two problems I've seen with Faker here. So like Faker is really, in the end, if you go and look at the code in GitHub, all it's doing is for something like first name, it's just got a list of a bunch of first names, and it's just picking one at random out of there. So it's really important that if the data that you're testing is important to you, like if you're asserting, let's say that you have 3 users and you have some method that's going to return them by their last name in alphabetical order, right? You need to be setting specifically that last name for each of those users and not letting Faker choose it for you. Because one, if you let it choose it for you, you don't know what it's going to be that time, right? So sometimes it might be, I don't know, like Smith, and sometimes it might be Anderson, and that's going to drastically change the order of things returned in your test if you care about that. I've also seen it cause collisions where we had some test flake because we were asserting an order of like users returned by email, and sometimes the email got chosen was actually like the same one as we had set in another test, because it is just picking something at random. So the important thing is, like, if you care about that data and you're asserting against it in your test, you need to not let Faker choose it for you. Also, setting environment variables explicitly. So when you're running your full test suite, right, tests are going to be run in a random order, assuming you have the random seed set with RSpec, which you definitely should. So the best way to get around having environment variable collisions where it gets set in one test and then a different test expects it to be somewhere else is to always set them in round blocks. So you can grab the original value, the environment variable, set it to the thing you need it, run your test, and then set it back to the original value. So you're basically not leaking state, right, between one test and another, since environment variables are global to the entire test context. This one I have seen people do. If you are testing a private method using send, this is a huge, huge smell that you're, one, violating the single responsibility principle for your class, and two, have a major opportunity to refactor your code here, right? Like if you find yourself needing to use send to reach into the internals of your class to test some private method there, you probably have something that you can actually extract out from that class, right? Your like public method, any public method you have on a Ruby class is basically defining what the public API is, right? So we care about the behavior of the end result of calling this thing, but we shouldn't care about the internals of how it's implemented. If you are reaching in to do that, you should probably be extracting that entire method as some sort of class, right? That then has a public method that you then can test on its own. Similarly, stubbing out private methods. I've seen it test. Also a smell here, right? You're now coupling your test to the internal implementation of that class, which makes it harder to refactor later, right? I've now basically in my test called out some specific name of a method that I want to stub out its behavior. And so now if I really want to like refactor that class, I can't just like go changing some of my private methods around because I've gotten too much into the internals there. So methods are private for a reason, right? Anything outside of that actual class, which includes the test testing it, shouldn't actually know about them. So things that I can't allow is like stubbing out external calls. A lot of times, let's say you're contacting a third-party API, you obviously don't want to like do that in a real test. So wrapping anything that talks to API in one class and then stubbing that out in all other tests so it doesn't do that is fine. That thing might be called within a private method, but it's like a call to a different class. And then sometimes I've seen people stub out private methods just because they got lazy, creating the correct like active record setup that would allow them to test a certain scenario. So I have refactored some tests like that to basically undo the stubbing to say like, okay, yes, it was a bit of a complicated, data setup. We needed these users and a bunch of this other class, a bunch of this other thing, but like that's actually representative of what we are trying to test here. This one's was definitely controversial at Gusto. So subject by default is a keyword in RSpec that is described class.new. Described class is the other keyword, which is literally what it says. It's the class of the thing that you're testing. So to me, subject is the object under test, right? And when people refactor it and override it to actually be like subject dot do the thing that I'm trying to do, it looks very weird to me then in the test to have some setup and then just the word subject and then assert a bunch of stuff. Because like, one, subject is a noun, it's not an action, right? And two, now I need to go look for where you overrode that to see like what method are you even calling as part of this thing. So personally, I only ever override subject when I need to pass some arguments to the initialize method. So then it would just be like subject block describe class.new with whatever things I need to pass into there. I personally see this as another sort of form of unnecessary dryness that makes the test a little more difficult to read. And I think also I've seen more junior developers kind of struggle with that too, that like sometimes subject is the class, an instance of the class under test, and sometimes it's me taking an action on that instance of class under test, which makes it a little confusing. Similarly, so we talked about the 3 A's earlier. It's pretty common in RSpec to assert that some instance of a class or something receives some method with some arguments, right? You do that in order to sort of isolate your class under test and not always have to call through a bunch of different classes on there. But I even struggle with this many times where there is a format where you can say, expect this thing to receive some method call, and then I act on my thing, and that's it. That's the test. So it's now like act and then assert, assert and then act, which is weird. So I always do the more verbose format of this, which is allow my thing to receive the method I care about, then do the thing, and then expect my thing to have received that method that I care about, which keeps your arrange, act, assert format. And it's a lot easier to sort of wrap your head around. I'm like positive we've all been there as a developer where it's not in that format and do the expectation first. And you get very confused as to why your thing is like not passing over and over again before you realize it's because you have the thing in the wrong order. So it's 3 lines instead of 2. But personally, I think this is way easier to actually follow, and then you never break that arrange, act, assert pattern in your tests. This one's really just for readability here and kind of focusing on the like, how do I sort of keep my tests small and isolated? RSpec has some cool matchers. So anything is one of them, which is really like, you can say if you have a hash, you have a key, and then the value is just anything. If I don't care about that value in my hash, that's not the thing I'm testing against right now. You can also specify parts of hashes by saying like expect this thing to be a hash including some key I care about, some value I care about, and ignore the other like 10 keys and values that are in there. I tend to find it's a lot less readable when people say like expect this response to be some giant blob of a bunch of 10 different keys and values, when really all I'm trying to care about is like 2 or 3 of them in there for the purpose of this test. So I tend to really enjoy using RSpec's sort of like composability of a bunch of different matchers that they have in here to really like make sure to focus on what I'm actually trying to test in that specific test. This one is a pet peeve of mine. I don't like if blocks without a title. Tests are documentation, right? They are documentation for you and your reviewer and your future self a year from now who doesn't remember why you wrote this test and you get blamed your code and realize it was you who did this thing, and other future developers who are going to work at your company. Especially coming from a place like Gusto where you have 400 plus people working on like one Rails project, it's really important that you leave good documentation for everybody, right? So I tend to find when people just have an it block without a title, like that's not helpful to me when I go to look at the test file to read through like what is this class actually supposed to do. Now I sort of need to like make inferences and whatnot instead of having a nice, I don't know if anybody uses RubyMine, but you can sort of collapse everything down and then just start breaking out it blocks and like opening them back up. It's really easy to just read through like all the different things that this class is supposed to do. And if you don't specify a title that says exactly what you're doing, it's harder to follow. Another source of flakiness Don't specify specific IDs for active record objects. Talking about the database level, for every table you create, there's a sequence that goes along with it that keeps track of what the next ID should be there. You don't need to specify certain IDs, sort of similar to before, like your test database is going to get wiped in between runs, but it's very possible that at some point you end out with a certain test run where that ID of 15 that you specified directly for some active record object actually gets taken before that, and then everything starts failing. So like just always allow the ID, the sequence to set the ID for you. And then if you need to reference it for a different object, right? Like you're trying to tie two objects together, you need one, you reference it as variable.id, and you never have to know exactly what that ID is. This is another smell one for me. So if you find yourself writing out your it statement block in your title here, and you're saying it does this and this other thing on there, then in general, that's kind of also a smell that like you're testing too many things in that one test, right? I love to use context blocks to break those up. So, you know, you have a context that says when you're an admin, it does this thing. When you're this type of user, it does this other thing. I think you can also like makes the title shorter and more to the point too. But yeah, I take this as a smell if I catch myself writing some sort of conjunction in there that it's probably actually like 2 tests or more that I need to be breaking out here. Don't use class variables. This one's kind of a testing one, but just one in general. So class variables, sort of like environment variables, are global to the context of that class, which means that every instance of that class shares that one class variable. So if it changes in one instance, it changes for everything. My good story about this is the very first job I had as a junior developer out of Turing, which is a coding school here in Denver. We were doing hotel bookings, right, for people. So we're actually like making calls to various agencies like Expedia and stuff to book real hotel rooms and charge people's real credit cards and whatnot. And in one of our classes responsible for the booking stuff, there was some class variable that controlled whether or not this was like, do this thing for real in production, or like, JK, it's testing, we're gonna stub it out. And there was just this giant comment block that just said like, never ever change this if you're gonna test on here, you're actually going to be trying to book hotel rooms from running the test suite, which was terrifying as a junior developer, but also like entirely unnecessary. So go back to this, yeah, like use environment variables that you can stub out and reset in the context blocks there. It's a lot easier to reason about too. Yeah, and so that's it. I've got some other resources in here. This was actually a slightly shortened version of this presentation because last time I did it, we got into way more discussion and it took like 2 hours. So I can probably post these links somewhere. But if you want to look at this one, I think this RubyConf talk from a few years ago when I was there is actually, it's on like non-deterministic specs and everything. It's one of the like better RubyConf talks that really walks you through like all the different ways you can have non-determinism and how to fix them and whatnot. So like highly, highly recommend watching that one.